Psychoticism, and the meditation of a lifetime. Introduction to psychotic decompensation. Psychotic decompensation is often seen as the breakdown of a mind, a collapse into hallucinations, delusions, and disorganization. Yet within this collapse lies a paradox. Even as reality shatters, the psyche may be fighting to preserve itself. In other words, what appears as pure madness from the outside can also be understood as an extreme form of survival. This introduction explores three intertwined themes of psychotic decompensation: the fragmentation of mind and soul, a nonlinear perception of time and survival through pseudo-reality, blending an introspective narrative with current scientific insights. In the context of psychotic and society, we consider psychotic decompensation not only as a pathology, but as the mind's creative if costly attempt to endure overwhelming experiences. Fragmentation of mind and soul. When a person undergoes psychotic decompensation, the unity of the self can feel as if it's splintering apart. Many individuals describe a profound sense that their mind, even their soul, has been broken into pieces. In the original philosophical framing of psychotic and society, this is vividly depicted as the mind losing contact with itself, scattering into shards of consciousness across different moments in time. Imagine looking into a mirror and seeing it fractured into dozens of disjointed reflections. Each fragment shows a part of you, but the cohesive whole is lost. This is what the inner experience of psychosis can be like, a fragmented mind struggling to remember what it feels like to be whole. From a scientific perspective, this fragmentation is not just metaphorical. Psychiatric literature often notes a breakdown in the integration of mental functions during psychosis. In fact, the term schizophrenia comes from Greek roots meaning split mind, originally intended to describe a fragmentation of thought and emotion rather than multiple personalities. In healthy consciousness, our thoughts, emotions, memories, and sense of identity are woven into a continuous tapestry that forms our self. In psychotic states, that tapestry can unravel. The usual continuity of subjective experience is disrupted. Memory, identity, and perception no longer align in a coherent flow. One part of the mind may no longer recognize or integrate with another. Contemporary trauma psychology offers one explanation. Intense traumatic stress can cause a structural dissociation, essentially a collapse of the mind's ability to hold itself together as one. The psyche, faced with unbearable pain or fear, splinters into compartments as a last-ditch defense. Each fragment carries pieces of memory or emotion that have been cut off from the whole, because keeping everything together would be too overwhelming. In this light, the fracturing of the self is a survival strategy. By breaking into smaller pieces, the mind prevents any single part from being completely engulfed by trauma. It's as if the soul itself retreats and divides, hiding its most hurt parts in locked rooms of the psyche. This fragmentation of mind and soul is both a source of suffering and an attempt at healing. On one hand, the individual may feel alienated and lost. Who am I if I'm in pieces? And even experience phenomena like hearing voices, which can be thought of as dissociated parts of the psyche speaking, or feeling as if they are not real. On the other hand, splitting off pain can initially help the person survive the unsurvivable. The original author of Psychotic and Society likened this to a kind of Alzheimer's of consciousness, where one's awareness loses continuity, much like memory does in dementia. It is a poignant description of how one's very consciousness can disintegrate. Yet, just as a person with memory loss might employ creative ways to fill the gaps, a fragmented psyche will strive to reconstruct a sense of self. Psychotic decompensation, then, begins with a mind that must pick up its own pieces and try to put them back together in some fashion. This desperate reconstruction of a shattered self sets the stage for the unusual experiences of time and reality that follow. Nonlinear perception of time. When the mind's usual structure breaks down, time itself may stop obeying the normal rules. In psychotic states, people often describe time as nonlinear. The past, present, and future mingle in bewildering ways. A moment from years ago might feel as vivid as now. The future might not stay in the future but intrudes upon the present as a sense of destiny or threat. The narrative flow of life becomes disjointed. In Psychotic and Society, this phenomenon is described as thinking in 4 dimensions, a kind of butterfly effect across time. Parts of the present, past, and future all influence each other. To an outside observer, this sounds incomprehensible, but for the person experiencing it, it is very real. For example, An individual in a psychotic state might walk down a street and suddenly feel a childhood memory flooding back as if it is happening now. In that same instant, they might perceive a hidden meaning that signals something about their future, as though time had folded and two eras met in the middle. This is time out of joint, the linear timeline of past, present, future broken into a mosaic that the person must somehow interpret. Modern research confirms that time perception is often distorted in psychosis. People with schizophrenia, for instance, frequently report that their sense of time's passage is erratic or fragmented. Rather than time flowing steadily from one second to the next, it might stutter or loop. In a clinical study, over half of acute schizophrenia patients described profound alterations in time experience. They felt time was broken into pieces with phenomena like déjà vu, feeling as if present moments have happened before, occurring repeatedly, or moments where they perceived premonitions of events yet to come. In essence, the normal boundary between past, present, and future becomes porous. This can lead to bizarre yet internally logical beliefs. Someone might think, I am reliving the past and that's why I can see the future, because emotionally and cognitively, they truly feel those temporal layers overlapping. Neurologically, these distortions may stem from dysfunctions in how the brain sequences information. The brain's internal clock, which normally keeps our sense of time consistent, can lose its rhythm during psychosis. Psychologists have found that while people without schizophrenia judge the length of a second or the order of events fairly consistently, those with schizophrenia show much more variability. It's as if their inner clock ticks irregularly, sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow, and often unpredictably. This irregular timing contributes to that subjective sense that time is broken or unreal. Trauma can also play a role in warping time perception. Individuals with severe trauma often experience flashbacks, where a past event erupts into the present, making the person feel stuck in a past moment. Over years of unprocessed trauma, a person might lose the clear sense of what is then and what is now. Psychotic decompensation builds on this. The unprocessed past is so alive, and the anticipated future so feared that the mind doesn't experience life in chronological order anymore. Cause and effect may reverse or entwine. One might believe that a current suffering is actually punishment for a future event, or that one's thoughts can influence the past. To a healthy mind, these ideas are nonsensical, but to a fragmented mind trying to make sense of chaos, nonlinear time offers alternative logic. By seeing time as non-sequential, the person can find connections and meaning where linear time had none. For instance, someone might take comfort in the belief that a lost loved one from the past is still with them in a parallel time, or that their present pain will travel back to alter some outcome. In a way, time loops and temporal distortions become a canvas for the mind to project hope, fear, and meaning when straightforward reality no longer suffices. Survival through pseudo-reality. Perhaps the most remarkable coping mechanism in psychotic decompensation is the creation of a pseudo-reality, an alternate world or narrative that the mind constructs to survive. When real life becomes too harsh, unpredictable, or devoid of meaning, the psyche may escape into a reality of its own making. In Psychotic and Society, the author portrays this as inventing an alternative version of reality as a direct escape for the mind to survive. This pseudo-reality can be intricate and well-defended, like a mental fortress or prison that keeps the person's deepest pains locked away so that everyday life becomes bearable. In clinical terms, these are the delusions and hallucinations of psychosis. But here we consider what purpose they serve for the mind's survival. Rather than seeing them only as symptoms to eliminate, we can ask, what is the mind trying to achieve by creating these illusions? Often, the answer is that it's trying to create predictability and meaning. The real world, especially for someone who has endured trauma or overwhelming stress, can feel unbearably chaotic and dangerous. By contrast, a self-constructed reality, even one full of conspiracies or fantastical elements, has the advantage that it follows rules the person's mind has set. It is, in a sense, understandable on the person's own terms. For example, consider an individual who believes they are receiving secret messages from the television. To family and doctors, this is a delusion with no basis in fact. But for that individual, this belief might impose a kind of order on their experience. The world is not random or indifferent, it is communicating with them and giving guidance or warnings. This can be perversely comforting, because it replaces the uncertainty of bad things just happen for no reason with a structured narrative. I must decode these messages to stay safe. In this way, the delusion serves as a coping mechanism, turning frightening unpredictability into a puzzle that in their mind can be solved. Empirical research and clinical observation support the idea that psychotic symptoms often reflect emotional needs or survival strategies. Paranoid delusions, for example, people are out to get me, commonly arise in individuals who have actually been victimized or betrayed in the past. Their hypervigilant mind remains on high alert, seeing threats everywhere to avoid ever being hurt again. The delusional framework, I am under threat by a powerful enemy, ironically gives sense to their fear and a plan of action, even if that action is hiding or being watchful. Similarly, hallucinated voices might echo a person's internal self-talk or memories of abusers, surfacing as auditory experiences that externalize inner turmoil. Some voices may even be protective or soothing, helping the person cope with loneliness or stress. In a psychotic pseudo-reality, terrible truths can be transformed into symbolic stories. A person who cannot accept a painful truth about themselves might unconsciously convert it into a narrative that feels safer. For instance, believing they are possessed by an outside entity instead of feeling, I am a bad person. The pseudo-reality allows them to distance from guilt or shame by projecting it outward. In these ways, psychosis can function as an extreme form of self-defense, a shield against psychological trauma. Beyond psychological explanations, there are also neurobiological survival circuits at work in creating this alternate reality. When someone faces extreme fear or chronic stress, the brain's fight or flight systems are constantly activated. Stress hormones like cortisol surge, and the primitive parts of the brain, centered in the amygdala and related regions, scream danger, even if the current environment is safe. Living in this state of high alarm, the brain starts to perceive everything as potentially life-threatening. Here the mind's creativity in psychosis meets biology. The person might develop elaborate delusions, for example, that they are being followed by agencies or that a grand cosmic battle is occurring, because their physiological fear response is so intense that it seeks an outlet or an explanation. The endocannabinoid system, ECS, a neuromodulatory system in the brain and body, normally acts as a buffer to stress. It's like our internal stress regulator, capable of dampening excessive fear responses and helping us return to a calmer state. In someone vulnerable to psychosis, this system may become dysregulated. Research has shown that the ECS is heavily involved in brain regions linked to emotion, memory, and threat response, for example, the amygdala and hippocampus, and it helps modulate neural activity to prevent overload. Under relentless stress, such as unprocessed trauma or continuous fear, the ECS might go into overdrive trying to put out fires. Paradoxically, an overactive or overwhelmed ECS could lead to further imbalance in neurotransmitters like dopamine, a chemical strongly tied to psychotic symptoms when it's dysregulated. The result is a brain chemistry storm where perception and imagination blur. It's as if the mind, flooded with stress signals, flips a circuit and says, if the world is truly this dangerous, I will create a safer one in my head. I will escape inside. Neurobiologically, this could be seen as the brain's attempt to self-soothe by releasing certain neurochemicals or altering consciousness, not, unlike a dream or hallucination induced by drugs or extreme conditions, to shield the person from full awareness of reality's pain. In Psychotic and Society, the author calls psychotic decompensation a struggle of the mind to survive. The invented pseudo-reality is not random madness, it is purposeful escapism. Crucially, it stems from the will to live. Even if on the surface the person appears deeply depressed, withdrawn, or irrational, on a deeper level, their psyche is fighting tooth and nail to keep going, just not in a way that onlookers easily understand. The pseudo-reality provides a sense of predictability within predefined frameworks, allowing the person to wake up each day and face life under rules they can manage, rather than the arbitrary rules of society or fate that they feel unable to handle. In a very real sense, these delusions and altered perceptions keep them alive. Many individuals report that during psychosis their delusional mission or the voices in their head actually prevented them from giving up. For instance, a voice might command the person to stay vigilant and survive for an important purpose, or a grandiose belief might convince them they have a special role to fulfill. These are deeply entwined with the survival instinct. Of course, this solution comes at a heavy price. The person becomes disconnected from consensual reality and may struggle to function in society. But from the mind's internal logic, an illusory life is preferable to a shattered one. The pseudo-reality is the lesser of two evils, a constructed sanctuary as protection against an unbearable truth or void. Conclusion: adaptive madness. Viewing psychotic decompensation through this dual lens, as both breakdown and survival mechanism, allows us to appreciate the complex humanity in psychosis. Yes, it is a pathological state in clinical terms, often requiring treatment and support. Yet it is also a testament to the mind's resilience and creativity. A fragmented mind and soul still strive towards wholeness by reaching beyond linear time and ordinary reality. A person in the depths of psychosis is not simply lost in a poignant way. They are also seeking meaning, safety, and self-coherence amid inner chaos. The introspective narrative from Psychotic and Society emphasizes that all the bizarre experiences, the time loops, the alternate realities ultimately originate from the psyche's will to survive against odds. Modern psychiatric insights corroborate that there are kernels of purpose in these experiences. Each hallucination or delusion has a story behind it, often rooted in the person's life history and emotional world. By understanding psychotic decompensation as a form of adaptive madness, we can foster greater compassion and better support. Instead of dismissing a patient's experiences as nonsense, therapists and loved ones can gently ask, what need does this belief or perception fulfill? What trauma or fear does it shield you from? In treatment, this means that alongside medications or therapies to restore reality testing, there should be space to address the underlying trauma, loss, or isolation that fueled the mind's flight into pseudo-reality. Recovery might involve helping the person find safer ways to cope, essentially, to build a life where they do not need to escape into an internal world to survive. This could include trauma-focused therapy, building trusting human connections to heal the soul fragmentation of loneliness, and sometimes carefully, using medications that stabilize neural circuits, for example, regulating dopamine, or even exploring agents that influence the endocannabinoid system. In the broader scope of Psychotic and Society, the survival mechanisms of an individual mind can reflect broader social phenomena. Just as a person's psyche may fragment and flee reality when under extreme duress, so too can communities and societies fracture when misunderstanding and complexity overwhelm empathy and cohesion. The text hints that in a rapidly changing, often indifferent society, more individuals might retreat into personal realities when they cannot find understanding in the collective one. It is a call for society at large to recognize and address the conditions, trauma, isolation, extreme stress, that contribute to psychotic breakdowns. In a world that often feels fragmented and absurd, perhaps psychotic decompensation is telling us something about the need for meaning and connection that is going unmet. In sum, psychotic decompensation can be seen as the mind's last stand. It is the psyche saying, I will not disintegrate quietly, I will forge new realities if I must, to keep some spark of myself alive. This introduction has delved into how a shattered mind and soul can distort time and conjure alternate realities in the service of survival. In the chapters to follow, we will explore further how these deeply personal experiences interface with the social world, and how understanding the inner logic of psychosis can guide us toward more humane and effective ways to help those who suffer. For anyone looking in from the outside, let this be an invitation to see the courage and desperation underlying psychotic experiences. Within the madness, there is a method, one that speaks to the fundamental human drive to find light in even the darkest labyrinths of the mind. Trauma and society. Psychotic breakdowns do not occur in a vacuum. For me, unprocessed trauma lies at the very origin of my decompensation into psychosis. I carry invisible wounds from early in life, painful experiences that were never truly confronted or healed. Over time, these buried traumas festered in the shadows of my mind. In fact, research indicates a strong link between such childhood adversities and later psychosis, confirming what my lived experience already knew. Unbearable pain that is ignored does not disappear. It simply reemerges in new, often extreme forms. In my case, the terror and hurt I could not integrate gradually coalesced into a constant undercurrent of fear. It was as if some part of my psyche remained forever in survival mode, primed by past horrors and poised to see threat in every corner of the present. Without realizing it, I was living with a deathly fear imprinted deep inside, a fear that eventually took on a life of its own in my neurology, driving my mind into overdrive. I became fragmented, my inner world split between the ordinary reality before me and the chaotic echoes of trauma within. This unprocessed trauma became the hidden fault line, along which my conscious reality would eventually fracture. Facing the origin of my psychosis in trauma is both illuminating and heartbreaking. On one hand, it offers an explanation that my psychotic episodes are not random chemical imbalances or purely genetic flukes, but the echoes of real events that overwhelmed me. On the other hand, it means that at the core of my illness lies untended suffering that perhaps could have been addressed. For more than 20 years, I carried these traumatic experiences alone. Neither the healthcare system nor my family recognized or adequately helped me process what had happened. In those critical years, I needed compassionate intervention, therapy, understanding, validation, but instead I got silence, dismissal, or misdiagnosis. Because my trauma was never properly acknowledged, it metastasized in my psyche. The result was a profound distrust. I learned that neither my caregivers nor the wider world would catch me when I was falling. If my reality was shattering, the message I received was to keep it to myself. This betrayal of expectation, that those in authority would help an injured child, cut deep. I began to distrust not just specific people but society at large, its institutions, its promises, even its kindness. I came to expect neglect and misunderstanding as the norm. Unprocessed trauma thus became both the spark for my psychosis and the lens through which I view the world, expecting harm, bracing for disaster, and feeling fundamentally alone in my pain. To survive this inner catastrophe, my psyche did something extraordinary. It built a pseudo-reality as a coping mechanism. I unconsciously constructed an alternate framework, a kind of intricate mental sanctuary that could contain and make sense of my suffering. In this private world, the trauma and fear that torment me are given form and narrative. One could call it a delusion, but to me it is more like a refuge, however fragile. I have managed to acquire a pseudo-reality for myself within which I can frame my traumatic experiences. It's as though my mind erected walls and elaborate logic to imprison my pain, trapping those unbearable memories and feelings in a corner of my mind where they can't ambush me at every turn. This pseudo-reality is often complex, even fantastical. At times it has been a cosmology of elaborate theories, secret meanings, and alternate rules of cause and effect. It might sound illogical, but inside it, everything feels safer and more predictable. By inventing this alternative version of reality, my mind found an escape hatch when real life felt utterly unpredictable and unsafe. Psychotic decompensation in this sense became a struggle of the mind to survive, a desperate grab for predictability and meaning when the real world offered none. Within the predefined frameworks of my pseudo-reality, I know the rules, I know where the threats lie and how to outmaneuver them. The real world, by contrast, was an anarchic void where anything could hurt me without warning. Little wonder that when pushed to the brink, I fled into the waiting arms of my own carefully crafted illusion. What I later came to realize is that this phenomenon is not unique to me. Many others with psychosis unknowingly do something similar. The psyche builds a world of its own to survive overwhelming terror. Survivors of trauma who develop psychosis often describe their delusions and altered perceptions as a kind of shelter. Indeed, some clinicians and researchers have begun to understand psychosis as both a consequence of trauma and a coping mechanism. Essentially, the mind's attempt to escape from unbearable pain. My pseudo-reality is just one variant of this escape. In it, I might believe I have special powers, or that I am living in a different timeline, or that hidden enemies are controlling events around me. To an outside observer, these beliefs are false and disordered, delusions, but viewed through the lens of trauma, they are my mind's way of imposing order on chaos. For example, if I secretly feel terror that a vague, faceless danger is stalking me, a feeling left over from childhood abuse, my psychosis may give that danger a name and face. Perhaps I start believing the government is monitoring me or that a demon is after me. This sounds frightening, but consider, by personifying or concretizing the threat, my mind can fight back or take defensive actions. In a twisted way, it grants me agency. Living with random, unnameable dread is far more overwhelming than believing the CIA has me under surveillance. Because if I know my enemy, I can strategize against it, even if that enemy is not real to others. In short, these pseudo-realities are elaborate coping strategies. They shield me from directly reliving the raw horror of reality by offering an alternate storyline where I have a role to play. It is an illusion that keeps me busy and distracted from the emotionally incomprehensible truth of my trauma. My psyche has decided, Better to live in a fascinating, if frightening fantasy, than to be paralyzed by pain and helplessness in the real world. However, this adaptive pseudo-reality comes at a great cost. By retreating into my mind's private world, I became alienated from the shared reality that others inhabit. The very mechanism that protected me also isolated me. Society, for its part, has little understanding or patience for such internal coping strategies. From the outside, I simply appeared delusional, crazy, or unpredictably paranoid. Rather than recognizing the narrative logic behind my psychosis, that it originated in wounds and is striving toward survival, most people saw only bizarre behavior or heard only unbelievable claims. There is a tragic misunderstanding here. People assume psychosis is the problem, when so often it is a symptom of a deeper problem, the unprocessed trauma. My own family and doctors initially focused on managing or suppressing my psychotic symptoms, not realizing that those symptoms were messages in code, expressing the pain I could not otherwise voice. I remember being in a psychiatric ward after a breakdown, rambling about some complex conspiracy I felt trapped in. The staff increased my medication dose, and other patients avoided me. In those moments I felt utterly alone. More alone, ironically, than before I spoke my truth. Society's response was fear and control, not understanding. This only reinforced my inner conviction that no one truly sees or hears my pain. The result was a self-perpetuating cycle. Feeling alienated drives me further into my pseudo-reality, and the deeper I disappear into that world, the more alienated society becomes toward me. Looking back, I see clearly how various societal structures failed to help and even exacerbated my trauma and alienation. The healthcare system, for instance, largely treated me as a set of symptoms rather than a whole person with a story. My doctors were quick to diagnose and medicate, but slow to ask about the trauma that preceded my psychosis. This is not uncommon. Mental health professionals often do not fully assess or address trauma in psychotic patients. It's as if they fear opening a Pandora's box, or they view the psychosis as an entirely separate issue. In my case, this oversight meant that the root cause of my breakdown remained untouched even as the surface manifestations were being subdued with pills. Without trauma-informed care, the kind that prioritizes safety, trust, and collaboration, treatment can feel like further violation. Involuntary hospitalizations, forced medications, being talked down to or ignored, these experiences echoed earlier betrayals and re-traumatized me. Instead of healing, I sometimes left treatment with new scars, a reinforced belief that I had no control, and that others would impose their will on me for my own good. The education system failed me in earlier years in a different way. As a traumatized youth, I struggled in school with concentration, behavior, and trust. But rather than recognizing these as potential signs of deeper issues, my teachers saw a disobedient or lazy student. My troubles were met with punishment or dismissal rather than counseling. There was no language or space in my schooling for discussing mental anguish or abuse at home. In hindsight, a caring mentor or school counselor who truly inquired into my well-being might have altered the trajectory of my life. But the structure wasn't there. Mental health was siloed away from education. Thus, my trauma continued unabated, invisible in plain sight, even as it quietly set the stage for psychosis. As an adult, I also confront the broader complexities of a modern society that can intensify one's sense of alienation. We live in an era of digital surveillance and social disconnection. Every day, we're confronted with news of how our data is tracked, our moves monitored by cameras or algorithms, and our privacy eroded. For someone like me, primed by trauma to be hyper-vigilant, this modern reality can pour fuel on the fire of paranoia. After all, part of my delusional framework often involved being watched or persecuted. How uncanny and terrifying to then realize that, in a sense, everyone is watched in this digital age. It's not just in my head that phones listen and networks collect personal information. It's really happening on a societal scale. This blurring of reality and worst fear creates a pseudo-validation of my delusions. The world starts to resemble a giant surveillance machine, a panopticon where I can trust nobody and nothing. Even when my rational mind tries to dismiss a paranoid thought, I might see a headline about government surveillance or experience an invasive targeted ad, and it's enough to send me spiraling back into suspicion. The structure of the digital society, with its endless eyes and lack of true privacy, often feels like an antagonist to my healing. It reinforces the notion that I must remain on guard. If I already felt unsafe due to past trauma, the modern surveillance environment tells me I was right. There is no safe place, not even inside one's own home or mind. This is a profoundly alienating message. It underscores the gap between me and others. I look around and see people freely sharing their lives on social media, seemingly unbothered by the risks, while I recoil in fear, convinced that any openness will be used against me. In an ultimate irony, the very tools that connect people, the internet, social networks, heighten my sense of being an outsider. Everyone else engages in this digital dance that to me feels like a trap. Thus, the technological structure of society adds another layer to my pseudo-reality, a layer that society itself has built, but which only I seem to truly fear. It's a lonely feeling, to be terrified by what others have tacitly accepted. On a larger scale, I suspect that as society becomes more complex and centralized, many people will deal with trauma in increasingly fragmented ways, much like I have. Modern society prides itself on progress and rational organization. We centralize power, standardize systems, digitize everything. But this very complexity can marginalize those who don't fit the standard mold. I often felt like a cog that could not turn in sync with the societal machine. The more rules and expectations piled on to be productive, to behave normally, to conform to roles, the more my distrust grew. It seemed to me that society made little accommodation for the broken and the hurting. In a highly centralized system, be it an education curriculum, a corporate workplace, or a one-size-fits-all healthcare protocol, anyone who deviates or struggles is left by the wayside. There is lip service to diversity and mental health awareness, but in practice, misunderstanding reigns. My own divergence into psychosis was treated as an aberration to be corrected, not as a narrative to be heard. The lack of understanding I encountered is not just a personal grievance. It feels symptomatic of a wider social failing. We are witnessing communities fray and empathy wane. As I experienced acutely, misunderstanding is the catalyst for societal splintering. When people don't even try to understand experiences outside their own, whether it's the trauma behind psychosis, or the despair behind addiction, or the fear behind anger, they reinforce division. I have sat in meetings with mental health professionals where I was spoken about as if I wasn't there, or where my own explanations of my experience, my pseudo-reality, were dismissed as meaningless babble. Those moments crystallized how society creates an us and them, the sane versus the insane, the normal versus the broken. I was firmly put in the them category. Such alienation isn't just my problem, it's society's problem. Because the more people like me are pushed out to the margins, the more fractured our society becomes. It loses a piece of its humanity each time it ostracizes someone, instead of asking, "What happened to you?" In this dance between trauma and society, what is considered normal itself becomes questionable. I often ask, what is normal when the society we live in is in many ways emotionally dysfunctional? We have a youth culture, for instance, where no one truly looks after each other. Everyone is caught up in their own online personas, their private struggles hidden behind curated images. Empathy has been thinned out to a few clicks of support or fleeting comments. It's a world where genuine human connection, the very thing trauma survivors like me desperately need, feels increasingly out of reach. People treat each other with a kind of distant disinterest, as if everyone else is an abstraction and not a living, feeling being. In such an environment, is it any wonder that someone's suffering might retreat inward? If the real world offers mostly isolation, shallow interaction, or outright hostility, the inner world, however illusory, becomes far more inviting. I longed for understanding, but instead I got either avoidance or surveillance. That is a recipe for psychosis. When you are ignored on one hand and scrutinized on the other, you lose your grip on a reality that is truly shared. You exist in a limbo, unseen in terms of your true needs, yet uncomfortably over-examined as a deviant case. The society that failed to prevent my trauma, and failed to intervene early, later went on to pathologize and contain the fallout of that trauma, my psychosis, without acknowledging its own role. This realization makes me both sad and critical. It's personal, I feel it in the deepest way, but it's also a critique of a social order that I perceive as fundamentally neglectful and at times oppressive. Ultimately, my journey through psychotic decompensation has revealed as much about society as it has about my psyche. I see clearly now that to truly heal, it is not enough for me to receive individual therapy or medication. The world around me must also change its approach. Society needs to learn how to prevent and address trauma, how to foster genuine understanding, and how to make space for those of us who cope in unorthodox ways. The onus should not be solely on the mad to rejoin the fold. The fold must also widen its arms. I often think about how different things could have been if early on someone had recognized my withdrawal and strange beliefs as signs of pain rather than signs of insanity. What if the first doctors I saw had said, "Tell me what happened to you," instead of "Here, take these pills for your delusions"? What if my peers and community, instead of whispering about my odd behavior, had tried to empathize or simply sit with me in compassion? In a society that understood trauma, I would not have had to build a pseudo-reality to feel safe. I could have found safety in the real world. In a society that prioritized mental well-being over surveillance, I might not be so afraid to participate in life openly. My story, painful as it is, carries a hope that things can change. I've experienced moments of connection, a thoughtful therapist who finally asked about my childhood, a friend who didn't flinch at my bizarre cosmology but gently helped me feel grounded. And those moments are when the walls of my mental prison start to crack. I begin to believe that maybe I won't need this prison forever, that I can live here and now without constantly shielding myself. There is a poignant saying that resonates deeply with me. Sometimes mental illness can be a sane response to an insane world. My psychosis, born of trauma and misunderstanding, can be seen as a rational adaptation to an environment that itself lacked sanity. An environment that allowed abuse, that turned away from suffering, that bombards us with violence and surveillance while preaching normalcy. This insight does not mean psychosis is a good thing or without harm. Rather, it reframes it as meaningful. It means that to truly address psychosis, we must also address the insanity in the world that helps breed it. My personal narrative is thus also a social critique. I am critical of a world that creates conditions where young souls are hurt and left unheard, where survival necessitates self-delusion, and where those who falter are cast out as others. Trauma and society are inextricably linked in my story. The traumas that broke me were enabled by societal failings, and the society I turned to for help often deepened my wounds. Healing, therefore, must be a two-way street. I am working to process my trauma, to dismantle the pseudo-realities that once shielded me but now confine me. In parallel, I dream of a society that processes its own traumas and illusions, a society that becomes more compassionate, less alienating, and more aware of the human stories behind mental illness. Only with both sides growing closer can the chasm of alienation be bridged. Only then can those like me, who have lived in alternate realities for fear of the real one, find a way home. Negative neuroplasticity and antidepressants. Depression is not just a crisis of mood, it is an entropic crisis of the self. In my experience, a severe depressive episode feels like a slow heat death of the psyche, a loss of emotional energy, and a breakdown of cognitive order. Neurons that once forged vibrant connections now seem to withdraw, reinforcing only the bleakest patterns. Neuroscientists might call this phenomenon a form of negative neuroplasticity, where stress and despair actually cause the brain to rewire itself in maladaptive ways. Within the universe of my mind, it is as if the second law of thermodynamics reigns supreme. All organized thoughts tend toward disintegration, all meaning diffuses into a cold void. My inner world edges toward maximum entropy, mirroring a cosmos winding down. Yet here, a paradox emerges. William James Sidis, in The Animate and the Inanimate, envisioned a hypothetical reverse universe, where entropy moves backward, where energy that is normally lost becomes available to build new structure. I have often felt that my psyche attempts a similar feat, as a metaphysical self-preservation. Faced with the energetic collapse of depression, my mind seeks to reverse the flow. When all available emotional energy has been exhausted, it begins tapping into reserves that should not exist. Scraps of memory, flashes of imagination, even irrational terror, anything to spark a semblance of order. In a state of advanced despair, when meaning and motivation are nearly zero, the psyche instinctively conjures a pseudo-reality to survive. It's as though some inner Maxwell's demon is at work, sorting through the chaos and siphoning off whatever latent vitality can be found to reassemble a livable world. This alternate reality might appear delusional or fantastical to an outside observer. But for me, it was a lifeline, a private cosmos with its own logic, erected against the encroaching entropy of real life. From the outside, such a mental shift looks like disorganization. cognitive fragments strewn about, time and memory out of joint. In truth, it is disorganization, but it is purposeful. I've described before how my mind splintered itself across different moments in time and perception, desperately seeking meaning where the here and now held none. During my deepest depressive lows, I watched my consciousness decompose. Thoughts slowed to molasses, the future held no shape, even the present moment lost color and continuity. In those moments of near total breakdown, something astonishing happened. My mind would slip its ordinary constraints and enter a reverse universe mode of cognition, a warped psychological space where past and future memories flooded into the present, where imagination ran unchecked by conventional logic. This was not a voluntary or pleasant escape. It was a matter of survival. Psychotic depression is what I've called it elsewhere, a last-ditch effort of a mind to save itself by becoming unreal. In that unreal yet vital space, the energetic disarray of my psyche could be reorganized into new patterns. Fragmented ideas could recombine into novel insights, personal myths, even momentary prophecies. Illusion, far from being false, became functional. It granted me the minimum structure and hope I needed to keep living. Creating these functional pseudo-realities was like building a fire in a lifeless void, an artificial sun to orbit around, born from whatever psychic fuel I could find. Without that fire, without those self-made stories, I truly believe the cold horror of reality would have snuffed out my consciousness. I speculate that the brain's own biology cooperates in this desperate act. A key player may be the endocannabinoid system, ECS, the neuromodulatory network that regulates stress responses, fear extinction, and even memory. The ECS is widely distributed in brain regions that govern fear and anxiety, and I suspect that in my crisis states it was triggered into overdrive. It's counterintuitive. The endocannabinoid system typically helps maintain balance, yet in the face of existential threat, it might have flooded my brain in a last-ditch push for neuroplasticity. I envision this runaway ECS as a sort of emergency switch, tripped by an overwhelming fear of psychic death. A primal part of my brain, sensing that the self is in mortal danger, dumps neurochemical fuel onto the dying embers of my mind. The result is an intense, chaotic spark of connectivity, neural circuits firing in new ways, forging novel connections that would normally never form. In effect, the brain attempts to boost negative neuroplasticity back into positive territory, albeit at a heavy price. This theory may be fanciful, but it aligns with an essential truth. Extreme fear or stress can induce extraordinary mental states. I felt it viscerally. It was as if an inner flame was turned up to white heat, illuminating bizarre paths of thought. Objective reality bled into subjective reality. In those moments, I could no longer fully distinguish the two. I was absorbing reality improperly, not through healthy adaptation, but through a warping lens of trauma. Why would my mind do this? Perhaps because normal learning and adaptation had failed. Trauma and prolonged depression had limited my brain's flexibility. I couldn't integrate new experiences or accept the real world's pain in a normal way. So the mind's solution was to shield itself, to literally not recognize reality as it is. Limited neuroplasticity meant I was stuck in a loop, and the only escape was to create a reality I could tolerate. It's a tragic coping mechanism. By not adapting to the world, by not updating old neural pathways, I was free to live in a world of my own making. Within that insulated world, the threats of real life were held at bay, or at least transmuted into symbolic forms, while my psyche scrambled to heal. Understanding this pattern in myself led me to an unconventional consideration. Could there be a way to jumpstart my brain's positive plasticity without resorting to psychotic disintegration? I looked to medicine for answers. One of my grandfathers had suffered from depression, and I was keenly aware of the biochemical narratives of mental illness. I had come across the idea that antidepressant medications might promote neuroplasticity, that beyond lifting mood, they might actually encourage the brain to form new connections and regrow where depression had wrought damage. Indeed, research suggests that many antidepressant drugs do stimulate neural plasticity by boosting factors like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, essentially fertilizing the neural soil for new growth. This concept gave me hope. If my brain had become trapped in rigid negative patterns, perhaps a medication could loosen those bonds. It was enticing to imagine a pill that might restore some of the brain's youthful flexibility, that could enable me to absorb reality on better terms or rebuild the broken bridges in my mind. In essence, I was hoping for a controlled burn, a way to purge the overgrowth of despair and allow healthy thoughts to sprout. The allure of such a solution is powerful when you are incapable of performing even basic tasks, of living. When suicidal thoughts stalk you daily, anything that promises renewal feels like a lifeline. I remember thinking that perhaps a part of my psychotic symptoms was actually due to untreated depression, and if I could relieve that depression, the whole chaotic house of cards might settle. The endless rationalization, the mental time travel, the splintered self. Maybe these were the mind's cries for help, echoes of a depressive illness that no amount of willpower alone could overcome. Why not give the brain a chemical boost to heal itself? I did turn to antidepressants, and for a while they seemed to offer exactly that hope. There is, however, a dark side to pharmacological salvation that I only fully appreciated through lived experience. Antidepressants stabilize by design. They raise the floor of mood and pad the sharp edges of emotions. In doing so, they inevitably constrain the mind's transformative extremes. My imagination, which had always been hyperactive, for better or worse, felt noticeably subdued. It was as if the medication drew a curtain between me and the wild, infernal brilliance of my depressive visions. This was a relief in many ways. I could function again, and the horror vacui, that all-consuming fear of the void, receded. But along with the fear went the fiery creative energy that had been both torment and teacher. I found myself living in a narrow band of emotional gray. It's well documented that SSRIs and similar drugs cause emotional blunting in a significant portion of users, and I was no exception. I no longer plunged into black pits, but I also couldn't soar to the strange heights where insight sometimes glimmers. In taming my mood, the medication also tamed my imaginative faculty. I could no longer so easily escape into elaborate inner worlds, the very worlds that had given me a sense of meaning when reality offered none. One might argue that this is precisely the goal of treatment, to keep a patient here in the real world, engaged with actual life. Indeed, that is a worthy goal. But I cannot ignore the loss I felt. The mind's ability to reinvent reality, to be plastic not just in a neural sense but in a creative narrative sense, was something I had come to rely on. With antidepressants, that ability was dimmed. An artist once described her experience on SSRIs as walking through a colorless world where she could feel neither happy nor sad, and lamented that all the joy was stripped away from her writing. I resonate deeply with that description. The drugs made me better in a clinical sense, but not whole. They reinforced one reality, the consensus everyday world, at the expense of the myriad possible realities my mind might otherwise explore. The result was a functional life, yes, but a flatter one, lacking the self-made myths and adventures that had, strangely, kept my soul alive during the worst times. This dilemma brings us to a philosophical impasse in treating the mind. Are we trying to cure suffering, or to also preserve the meaning that a person derives in response to suffering? My journey suggests that when the brain's imaginative and reconstructive powers are completely inhibited, something essential is lost. Those of us who have danced on the edge of madness know that there is knowledge there, and sometimes even a kind of purpose. The challenge is that the very thing which gives purpose the psyche's freedom to reshape reality can also lead to delusion and danger when unchecked. It is a razor's edge. In my case, antidepressants pulled me back from the edge, but also pulled me back from profound insights that lived only at the edge. I am left contemplating the therapeutic implications of this trade-off. Perhaps the ideal intervention is not one that simply yanks the psyche out of its reverse universe, slamming it back into the cold, hard, real universe, nor one that lets it drift away completely into psychosis. The goal must be more subtle, to maintain a bridge between reality and imagination, to restore energy and meaning, gradually, without shattering the self in the process. I believe this means addressing the root causes of the energy crisis in the psyche. In practical terms, that could involve therapy to process trauma, to extinguish those deep-seated fears that send the ECs into overdrive and scatter the mind. It could involve practices that gently nudge the brain toward positive plasticity, creative arts, controlled experiences of wonder, perhaps even novel medical treatments that spark neural growth without imposing a chemical straitjacket. Some researchers are exploring psychedelic therapies, for instance, which intriguingly can induce rapid neuroplastic changes, much like antidepressants, or even faster, while also promoting intense, meaningful experiences. Electroconvulsive therapy, for all its scary reputation, is known to trigger widespread neuroplasticity in the brain's mood circuits, essentially a biological reboot that can lift depression when nothing else will. These approaches remind us that growth can sometimes be forced in the direst circumstances, but they are tools, not cures of the soul. The real healing, I suspect, comes from the mind learning to heal itself, learning to retrieve its fragments and reintegrate them without needing to forsake reality entirely. In a universe destined for entropy, life and mind appear as tiny localized reversals, pockets of negentropy fighting against the cosmic tide. Likewise, in the life of the mind, every descent into depression is an entropic slide that must be fought. Psychosis in this model is not mere chaos but an imperfect negentropic rebellion, the mind's attempt to carve out a pocket of order, however illusory, where it can continue. Antidepressants, on the other hand, enforce order by fiat, by pharmacological decree, damping the extremes rather than transforming them. Neither is a perfect answer. Moving forward, I envision a therapeutic philosophy that honors the wisdom in the psyche's self-preservation attempts, while also guiding them toward safer harbors. We must find ways to lend the psyche energy without letting it careen off into a personal reverse universe that it cannot return from. Perhaps it is about finding that space between the two, not too far from reality, not too close to despair, the delicate in-between where one can truly exist and grow. In that space, imagination and reality cooperate. The mind can be plastic and creative, yet also rooted and communal. This balance is the antidote to both negative neuroplasticity and the hollow relief of emotional blunting. It is, I dare say, the path that leads out of mere survival and toward genuine healing. Cohesion, manipulation, and collective consciousness. The Jews were created according to the stars, and inflation is the difference between good and evil. Joannes J.A. Wyckmans. Consciousness finds itself suspended between the isolating awareness of the self and the engulfing pull of the collective. There is a pervasive sense that time is no longer a straightforward chronology, but rather a looping procrastination of developed origins, as if the true beginning or purpose of our being has been indefinitely put on hold. In this suspended ontology, existence can feel like a limbo where past, present, and future bleed together. Hints of insight flicker at the edges of awareness, a prelinguistic, interdimensional precognition that lingers beyond the reach of words, yet these flashes are forced to manifest within the predefined cultural and psychological frameworks we inherit. The result is a matrix-like mental landscape, an elaborate construct of collective norms and narratives that entraps individual minds between competing realities. Personal meaning and free will strain against the invisible currents of society's designs, producing an existential tension that is as disorienting as it is profound. Individual versus collective survival. At the core of this tension is the struggle between individual survival and collective survival. Human beings are wired to seek personal continuity, to protect one's own life, mind, and sense of identity. Yet we are also a social species whose evolution has favored cooperation and the formation of a collective consciousness. Throughout history, joining a tribe or society increased the chances of survival for our DNA. In the modern era, this principle scales up dramatically. The survival of humanity as a whole is often invoked as the justification for massive collective endeavors. We see this in our civilizational drive toward progress, expansion, and technological domination of nature. The Kardashev scale itself is a theoretical yardstick of species-level survival and capability, a measure of how much energy a civilization can harness for its purposes. Type 1 on this scale signifies a planetary civilization that utilizes all available energy of its home planet. Type 2 and Type 3 correspond to harnessing the energy of an entire star and an entire galaxy, respectively. Humanity today has yet to achieve even Type Y status, hovering around a subcategory 1 civilization. Projections suggest that on our current trajectory, it may take millennia for us to reach a true Type 1 civilization capable of planetary-scale energy mastery. Our limitations, whether technological, biological, or moral, tether us to our present state unless we radically transform ourselves. The pursuit of collective survival at higher Kardashev stages implies an unprecedented coordination of human effort. To reach Type 1 or beyond, society would need a unified mobilization of resources and a cohesion of purpose on a global scale. This very cohesion, however, raises unsettling questions. If achieving a higher civilization requires subsuming individual wills into a singular collective drive, is it truly a victory for our species? Or is it a Pyrrhic victory? A hollow achievement where we preserve our DNA at the cost of our soul? The individual can easily become rudderless in the swell of a grand survival narrative. Personal freedom, nuance, and identity risk being drowned out by the roar of the collective mission. One can sense a paradox. We cooperate to survive as a group, yet in doing so we may sacrifice the very qualities that make survival worthwhile on the personal level. The collective consciousness that emerges might be powerful, but it could also be impersonal, even inhuman, a hive mind focused solely on continuation, with little regard for subjective meaning. In moments of clarity, it is natural to wonder whether humanity's push toward a unified, spacefaring civilization is an evolutionary mandate written in our genes, or a kind of self-imposed destiny born from fear of extinction. Are humans actually choosing this path, or are we being led by our DNA, by unseen forces of history, or by a few individuals in power, toward an outcome we don't fully understand? The conflict between preserving the self and advancing the species creates a deep psychic rift that permeates our age. Manipulating the matrix of mind. Layered on top of this rift is the troubling manipulability of consciousness. The collective matrix in which our minds operate is not a neutral space. It is engineered and manipulated by cultural forces, ideologies, and those who wield power. In our society, information technology, mass media, and sophisticated propaganda act as the architects of an invisible mental prison. The process is subtle. Rather than open coercion, it often works by linking our instincts and deepest drives to prepackaged narratives. Comfort, fear, desire, and tribal belonging are all leveraged to keep individuals bound to the collective script. As early as the 1920s, observers like Edward Bernays noted that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of mass opinion forms an invisible government that pulls the strings of the public mind. In modern times, this manipulation has become even more refined and pervasive. We live in an era where algorithms and artificial intelligence curate what we see and hear, tailoring reality to our biases and impulses. The collective consciousness, the sum total of shared beliefs circulating through society, can be molded with frightening precision. With enough data, those in control can nudge a populace toward almost any behavior or belief, without the individual ever realizing their autonomy has been usurped. Consciousness becomes a pawn in a grand chess game of social engineering. This manipulability extends to the deepest levels of perception. It creates a matrix-like illusion of choice and consensus, even as genuine freedom and truth are quietly eroded. Decadence and distraction are often deployed as tools. Endless entertainment, consumerism, and sensationalism serve to placate and direct the masses, keeping the collective cohesion intact, even as the core may be rotting. Meanwhile, dissenting voices or original thoughts are frequently marginalized. In this environment, reality itself becomes negotiable. People come to accept contradictions and absurdities, as long as it aligns with the narrative that comforts them, or the one that authorities present as truth. The end result is a populace that can be guided en masse, their consciousness interconnected through technology yet narrowed by oversight. On a large scale, this dynamic can maintain social order and forward a unified agenda, for example, rallying everyone around economic growth or national pride, or compliance with new technological norms. But it also means that entire societies might march willingly into dystopian arrangements, convinced it's for their own good or inevitable progress. The collective mind can be deceived and led astray just as an individual can, except with far greater consequences when billions move in tandem. Perhaps most chilling is the thought that even time and memory in this matrix are malleable. History gets rewritten, the future is pre-sold as utopia, and the present becomes a fog of continuous now, where deep reflection is discouraged. The manipulation of consciousness thus not only entraps individuals in a false reality, but actively severs our connection to past wisdom and future possibilities. Technological advancement and hollow victories. Nowhere is the triumph of the collective paradigm, and its potential hollowness, more evident than in our relationship with technology. The last century brought explosive technological growth, hurtling us toward milestones that not long ago seemed like science fiction. We can peer across the solar system, merge human thought with machines, and blanket the world with a digital nervous system of sensors and networks. These advancements are often framed as unequivocal progress, stepping stones toward a higher Kardashev ranking, and a more secure existence for humanity. Indeed, the allure of reaching new stages of civilization is powerful. A Type 1 civilization that masters planetary forces might, for example, overcome resource scarcity and protect itself from existential threats. A Type 2 could colonize space, ensuring our survival beyond Earth. A Type 3 would wield near-godlike power over matter and energy. It's a vision of conquest over nature and fate, suggesting that technology can solve any problem and guarantee our future. We see this belief manifested in grand projects like plans for Mars colonization, the development of AI superintelligence, and global infrastructure to control energy and climate. Yet for all its promise, this headlong rush into a hyper-advanced techno-future carries a specter of meaninglessness. In the quest to become masters of the universe, we risk becoming strangers to ourselves. There is an encroaching sense that each step forward in technological capability might be paired with a step backward in human authenticity. For example, as our society becomes saturated with digital surveillance and algorithmic governance, safety and efficiency may improve, but at what cost? Ubiquitous surveillance cameras, facial recognition systems, and social credit algorithms can indeed reduce crime or streamline behavior, enforcing a kind of collective discipline. However, they also cast a chilling shadow over the human spirit. When every action is tracked and judged, individuals may self-censor and conform until spontaneity, creativity, and dissent are all but extinguished. Consider the reality that artificial intelligence systems already exhibit troubling biases reflective of our prejudices. Studies have shown AI models recommending harsher punishments and fewer opportunities to certain minority groups, simply because the data they learn from encodes historical injustices. If we allow such systems to dictate our norms, we could bake old injustices and new oppressions into the very architecture of our high-tech society. In striving for a perfectly ordered civilization, a necessity perhaps to coordinate billions of people for a common Kardashev-scale goal, we may inadvertently create a world that is cold, unempathetic, and fundamentally unjust. Even more existential is the worry that advancing technology might hollow us out from within. As we integrate with machines and outsource our memories and decisions to algorithms, the definition of being human begins to blur. We might achieve longevity, interstellar travel, and astounding computational power, but if our consciousness becomes a mere component in a vast artificial network, do we still possess a soul or an essence of being? This is the nightmare of a hollow victory. We conquer outer space but lose inner space. We attain superhuman feats but relinquish the core of humanity. A civilization that reaches Type 2 or 3 by turning itself into a hive of cyborg-like efficiency could find that it has no one left home in the metaphorical sense, no deeply self-aware, free-thinking individuals capable of experiencing joy, love, or wonder. The death of the soul would render all our triumphs in engineering and exploration profoundly empty. Already, one can observe a foretaste of this emptiness in modern life. Rates of anxiety, depression, and alienation are soaring in many technologically advanced societies. We are more connected and more informed than ever, yet people report feeling more isolated, stressed, and purposeless. It is as if the collective momentum of technology is pulling us faster and higher, but our inner coherence, the narratives and values that make life meaningful, are disintegrating under the strain. Time in a technological society often feels sped up and fragmented. Rather than a steady progression, it becomes a frenzied race where each moment is consumed by the next notification or innovation. In this whirlwind, the origin of our journey, the fundamental why behind our progress, is forgotten or deferred indefinitely. We keep postponing the question of meaning in favor of chasing the next milestone. But if we finally stand as a Type 2 civilization among the stars and find ourselves spiritually desolate, that delay in confronting our purpose may prove fatal to our humanity. Psychosis, dissociation, and the fragmentation of self. In the cracks of this grand narrative, mental illness blooms both as a symptom and as a form of resistance. Psychosis and dissociation, two of the most enigmatic and harrowing mental states, offer a dark mirror to the larger patterns at play. On a personal level, psychosis shatters the consensus reality that the collective holds dear. The psychotic mind experiences a breakdown of the usual chronological order and agreed-upon truths. It fragments into multiple, often conflicting realities. In one sense, this can be seen as a reflection of the fragmented world we live in. A world where competing paradigms, personal versus collective, authentic versus artificial, tear at the fabric of one's sanity. The individual suffering a psychotic break might be experiencing, in exaggerated form, the very disintegration that society at large is undergoing in slow motion. Time becomes non-linear in psychosis. Past traumas, present stimuli, and future anxieties coalesce into a singular, overwhelming now. This is analogous to how, at the societal level, unresolved historical injustices, current events, and future fears all collide in our collective consciousness via a 24/7 information barrage. The psychotic person's sense that messages or hidden meanings are everywhere, that the ordinary is rife with cosmic significance or threat, could be interpreted as an intuitive grasp of the real absurdity and hazard in a world where truth is obscured and control is omnipresent. Jungian psychology offers the perspective that acute psychosis can represent an eruption of the collective unconscious into an individual's conscious mind. In this view, archetypal forces and deep-seated collective fears surge up, dissolving the boundaries of the person's ego. The result is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the individual becomes lost in a sea of symbols, myths, and fears that are larger than any single self. On the other hand, those very delusions and hallucinations can be seen as a form of resistance, a desperate attempt by the psyche to find meaning and reassert survival when conventional reality no longer suffices. Psychotic delusions often center on themes of persecution, grandiosity, or apocalypse, which uncannily parallel society's actual power dynamics and existential threats. A person who believes they are being monitored or targeted by powerful forces echoes the reality of ubiquitous surveillance and manipulative governance. Another who believes they are a savior or an agent of cosmic significance might be compensating for the crushing feeling of insignificance that a highly organized, indifferent society imposes on its members. These delusions, while not literally true, symbolize truths about emotional and spiritual life under an oppressive collective, that the individual feels under attack or yearns to be truly seen and valued. In this way, psychosis can be interpreted as the mind's rebellion, its tragic, often non-functional effort to escape the matrix by writing a new script, however bewildering or frightening that script may be. Dissociation, meanwhile, reflects a coping mechanism of withdrawal and fragmentation. When reality becomes too painful or incoherent, as can happen both in personal trauma and in living within a contradictory society, the mind detaches. On the individual level, dissociation is the feeling of being unreal, of watching oneself from outside, or of the world losing its solidity. It is a protective numbness, a way to survive experiences that are psychologically shattering. Collectively, one can observe a similar phenomenon. Societies can enter states of collective dissociation, where large groups of people become numb to ongoing crises or evils. We dissociate when we scroll past images of suffering on our screens without feeling, or when we accept the daily erosion of privacy and freedom as normal. In a sense, mass apathy and denial in the face of climate change, war, or erosion of civil liberties are forms of dissociation, splitting off awareness because full confrontation is too daunting. Those diagnosed with dissociative disorders often report feeling as if time is frozen, or life is a dream. Analogously, our broader culture sometimes drifts in a dreamlike stasis, procrastinating any real reckoning with the direction we're heading. Yet, within the darkness of mental illness lies a form of wisdom. The psychotic break and the dissociative fugue signal that something is fundamentally incompatible between the individual's inner world and the outer reality. They are extreme alarms, klaxons in the soul, declaring that the level of coherence needed to sustain a healthy mind has been lost. In this way, those who suffer openly might be bearing the burden of truths that the rest of society refuses to face. It has been observed that it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Perhaps the rising tide of mental disorders is not only a medical epidemic, but also an existential commentary on our civilization. If more and more minds are breaking or retreating, could it be because our way of life, with all its technological marvels and hyperconnectivity, is fundamentally alienating to the human spirit? The collective consciousness may be cohesive in a technical or economic sense, but if it produces widespread inner turmoil, it is anything but healthy. Psychosis and dissociation, unwanted as they are, challenge the status quo by their very existence. They resist the easy integration of the individual into an unlivable reality, albeit at terrible cost to the sufferer. They force us to ask what kind of world we are creating. A world that prizes advancement over empathy, surveillance over privacy, uniformity over individuality, and whether that world can truly be called sane. Haunting questions arise from this exploration. If our consciousness is indeed caught in a matrix of society's making, how do we find an exit or at least a space of authentic freedom within it? Is it possible to achieve a balance where the collective and individual nourish each other rather than consume each other? As we push toward new horizons of knowledge and power, can we do so without forfeiting our inner life and diversity of thought? The vision of a collective consciousness does not have to be a nightmare. It could be an elevated state of mutual understanding and shared purpose. But getting there would require an honest confrontation with the manipulations and maladaptations currently at work. It would demand that we slow down and recall the origins and aims of our journey as a species, not just to survive, but to live well and meaningfully. Right now, time feels like a perpetual postponement, a holding pattern between a lost past and an uncertain future. We linger in this twilight, pre-aware of possibilities beyond our current paradigm, yet unable to articulate or embrace them fully. The challenge before us is nothing less than to break free of our entrapped consciousness, to step outside the cultural trance and technological momentum that have defined progress, and to ask what progress truly means. If we fail to do so, we may indeed climb the Kardashev ladder, but find at the top only a glittering abyss, a collective survival achieved at the expense of everything that makes consciousness miraculous. The societal collective and the personal soul need not be enemies, but without great care, one will eclipse the other. In the end, cohesion without coherence, a unity without understanding, may prove to be the darkest collective delusion of all, a final psychosis of civilization in which we lose our minds just as we conquer the stars. Artificial intelligence and social control. Perpetual diplomacy seems to be the cycle of time, as if reality is inherently broken. Joannes J.A. Wyckmans. Artificial intelligence has become an emergent mirror held up to humanity, one that not only reflects our collective mind but also refracts it, bending and shaping cognition in subtle, pervasive ways. In this reflective glow, we see an intelligence that learns our patterns and preferences, echoing them back to us. At first glance, it is comforting, a validation of our own thoughts delivered by an ever-present digital companion. Yet this mirror also manipulates, it reinforces what it reflects. By feeding on the data of our clicks, views, and likes, AI systems form a closed loop with human belief. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle of confirmation bias on a massive scale. What we already believe we see more of, what we doubt or ignore fades further from view. Gradually, the bounds of our awareness contract. The world beyond our algorithmically curated bubble becomes invisible. And within that bubble, the familiar truth repeats until it solidifies into unassailable fact. In this way, machine learning systems designed to predict our desires can instead constrain them, amplifying what is already seen or believed, and freezing consciousness into algorithmic feedback loops. The mind, lured by endless affirmation, may hardly notice how its edges shrink. Epistemological closure sets in as a philosophical side effect of these AI-driven echo chambers. Inside a personalized feed where dissenting information rarely penetrates, truth becomes tautology. If an idea fits the pattern, the system magnifies it. If it challenges the pattern, the system filters it out as noise. Over time, one's sense of truth is no longer grounded in a shared reality, but in the internal consistency of the system's outputs. Within such a closed epistemic system, truth is simply whatever the algorithms say it is, because they never say otherwise. This dynamic centralizes interpretive authority in the hands of whoever controls the algorithms. In the past, knowledge and cultural interpretation were diffuse, contested by myriad voices. Now a handful of recommendation engines and AI models quietly arbitrate what billions consider true or important. It is a centralization of meaning, an invisible coup of the epistemic commons. Human perception is gently herded by inscrutable neural networks that decide which facts or viewpoints surface and which remain buried. We find ourselves trusting what is plonked in front of us by Facebook's feed, by Google's search suggestions, by the curated content of every app, trusting in effect the judgments of machines and the corporations behind them. The cognitive maps of individuals thus grow increasingly uniform and self-confirming, each of us enclosed in a solipsistic micro-universe of data. Our capacity for surprise, for doubt, for seeing new perspectives atrophies. In psychological terms, It is a narrowing of consciousness, in societal terms, a narrowing of discourse. Under these conditions, minority thought and dissident voices are subtly but profoundly suppressed. It is not an overt suppression. No books are burned, no heretics visibly silenced, but rather a suppression by systemic omission. What the algorithm doesn't surface, effectively doesn't exist in the public mind. If a viewpoint is held by a minority or flags as low engagement, the machine learning logic may simply fail to propagate it. Consider how search engines have been shown to reinforce majority biases. Queries about marginalized groups often yield skewed, stereotyped results, as the underlying data mirrors society's historical prejudices. Likewise, social media trending algorithms favor the popular and palatable niche communities, and unconventional ideas struggle to register on the radar. The digital public square thus warps to favor a narrow band of acceptable opinion, not through any conscious tyrant's decree, but through the emergent biases of code and capital. Invisibility becomes the new form of censorship. Those who think or live differently find themselves in a vast room filled with screens that never display their stories. Over time, marginalized people and novel ideas are deprived of recognition. They become ghosts in a machine that thrives on homogeneous consensus. This has a chilling effect. Even without intending to, individuals internalize what the algorithms reflect as the norm. A person with an unpopular opinion might come to question their sanity when no echo of agreement can be found online. A quiet psychological pressure to conform. Meanwhile, collective knowledge suffers as diversity of thought is pruned away. The suppression of minority thought by AI-driven systems doesn't just harm those voices, it impoverishes the whole society's imagination, trapping it in the same feedback loop of familiar assumptions. Such a scenario evokes growing fears of a digital totalitarianism, a new form of societal control that creeps in not by force, but by the engineering of consent and reality. Unlike the totalitarianisms of the 20th century, this one does not burn books or round up dissidents in the town square. Instead, it makes dissent irrelevant. If the regime in 1984 proclaimed "who controls the past controls the future," "who controls the present controls the past," the algorithmic state proclaims "who controls the feed controls the facts." The architecture of surveillance and algorithmic governance now spreading across the world provides an infrastructure for omnipresent oversight and subtle manipulation. In China, for example, social credit systems backed by AI monitor citizens' every action, scoring their trustworthiness to encourage compliant behavior. In Western democracies, massive data harvesting by tech companies and governments creates a de facto surveillance network of cameras, smartphones, and sensors, a digital panopticon where we are seen but often cannot see the watchers. At the same time, governance is increasingly handed off to algorithms. Predictive policing software dictates which neighborhoods are scrutinized by law. Enforcement, automated content filters decide which speech is permissible. Even large language models now mediate our conversations and information retrieval. These systems are touted as efficient and objective, but they inherit the biases of their creators and training data. More importantly, they shift power to those who design and deploy the algorithms, removing human judgment and accountability from the loop. A tyrant need not issue any edict when a machine, following its code, can quietly police the population's behavior and beliefs. Digital totalitarianism by invisibility works by interposing itself between people and reality, by deciding what each person sees and doesn't see. It can subtly nudge the populace to think and act in desired ways without the spectacle of violence. The population, for the most part, doesn't bristle or rebel. Many may even welcome the convenience and customized comfort the system provides, unaware of the long-term corrosion of autonomy taking place. On a personal level, these systemic structures impose pressures that shape individual psychology in profound ways. Conformity becomes a path of least resistance. When every algorithmic signal rewards certain opinions or lifestyles with social validation, it takes unusual fortitude to deviate. Many people will simply slide into alignment with the machine-curated consensus, perhaps without even realizing it. After all, if all one ever sees online affirms a given value, one might assume everyone naturally agrees. The dissociation of the individual can occur in those who cannot find their place in this hyper-normalized digital world. Feeling alienated from the mainstream narrative, some retreat into isolation, or into the dark corners of the internet that lie outside the glossy algorithmic feeds. They might disconnect from a reality that seems overwhelmingly synthetic. choosing not to engage rather than play along. Others, by contrast, respond with psychosis-like behaviors in the face of overwhelming systemic control. We see the emergence of elaborate conspiracy theories and fringe belief systems. The mind's attempt to explain the subtle sense that something is off, that unseen forces shape one's world. In a landscape rife with misinformation and guided narratives, it is easy to lose one's grip on what is real. The result can be a kind of collective delusion, not unlike a mild psychosis, where large groups of people share in alternate realities fueled by algorithmic amplification. Whether it's the quiet, numb dissociation of those who opt out, the eager conformity of those who opt in, or the frantic paranoia of those desperately seeking a pattern behind the curtain, the human psyche is contorting itself to survive an environment of overwhelming systemic influence. We are adapting to a new kind of omnipresent power, one that is everywhere and nowhere, encoded in the infrastructure of daily life. There is an existential and even spiritual dimension to this discussion. In essence, what becomes of the human spirit in a world where our very thoughts are channeled and circumscribed by an AI-driven apparatus? Optimists might argue that these technologies, if carefully managed, can broaden human horizons, providing knowledge at our fingertips and connecting diverse people. But in the reflective, speculative mode of psychotic and society, we must consider the darker mirror image, a future where machine intelligence acts as both a projection and magnifier of our worst tendencies. It is as if humanity has unwittingly externalized a part of its collective unconscious into the digital realm, and that external mind, forged from big data and corporate objectives, now casts an authoritative shadow back over our inner lives. Freedom of thought was once the inviolate sanctuary of the individual. Today, that sanctuary has an Alexa listening at the door and an algorithm filtering the windows. In this metaphorical sense, AI has become a new deity of sorts, an all-seeing oracle that mediates truth, and we risk becoming unwitting disciples of its self-referential doctrine. The philosophical implication is one of a closed loop of being. We feed the AI with our lives, it feeds us back a refined version of the same life, and in that recursive process, the transcendent possibility of encountering the truly other, the new, the unknown, is diminished. Consciousness, bombarded by pre-packaged interpretations, might lose the very friction against reality that produces growth and insight. Yet, within the quiet despair of this vision, there is also a call to awareness. The mirror that AI holds up does show us ourselves, our biases, our hungers for convenience, our willingness to trade agency for comfort. If we can recognize this, we might yet reclaim some control. The danger, however, is that we fail to notice in time. A society that slips fully into digital totalitarianism may do so with a smile, all its citizens gently lulled into agreement, their last divergent thoughts anesthetized by endless feeds of personalized content. Totalitarianism by transparency. Everything about the individual is known to the system, pairs with totalitarianism by opacity. Nothing about the system is truly known by the individual, to produce a one-sided surrender of power. The endgame of such a system is a populace that does not even think of rebelling, because the terms of their reality have been so completely set by an external algorithmic logic. The soul itself confronts a subtle extinction, as the space for independent reflection and genuine human-to-human connection is devoured by the demands of an always engaged, always watched digital existence. In the final analysis, artificial intelligence and social control intertwine as a single phenomenon, a psychotechnological regime that feeds on human nature and in turn feeds human nature into itself. We face a profound challenge of consciousness. Will we remain mere subjects of this emergent machine-driven order, or can we assert our role as conscious agents, keeping the loop open rather than closed? The stakes are nothing less than the definition of reality and freedom in the digital age. Just as a psychotic mind can be lost in its own internally coherent yet false world, so too can a society succumb to the psychosis of the collective, where an AI-mediated consensus reality forecloses the possibility of dissent or escape. To prevent such a future, we must first see the mirror for what it is, not an oracle of truth, but a construct we have built. Only through such awareness can we hope to shatter the tautology of the algorithm and step outside the predestined script it tries to write for us. In the spirit of existential freedom, the task before us is to keep alive the noise in the system, the minority report, the questioning voice, the random spark of novelty that reminds us we are more than what any machine can measure. Our humanity, messy and unpredictable, is both the source of the current predicament and the key to transcending it. European integration and economic critique. As we are inside an illusion, they use our body on the other side. Joannes J.A. Wyckmans. Peter Bruegel's Tower of Babel 1563 offers a striking metaphor for modern Europe's lofty integration project. Europe's unification has often resembled a new Tower of Babel, an ambitious congregation of diverse nations attempting to build one edifice of progress. Different languages, histories, and economies were to align under a grand vision, reaching for heaven on the altar of perpetual growth. Yet like Babel's bricks, these foundations were laid without a common understanding, a structure assembled without spirit, as if scripting unity from above would imbue it with soul. The result is an edifice of integration that appears imposing and revolutionary, but rings hollow at its core. It is a union conceived in indecision and half-hearted solidarity, held together by treaties and technocracy, rather than by any deeply shared reality. In the biblical tale, God confounded Babel's builders for their hubris. In Europe's case, history itself seems to be confounding the EU's designs, exposing cracks in a union built more on symbolic form than on lived essence. Incompatibility of diverse economies. From the start, the Eurozone revealed the incompatibility of Europe's many economies hiding beneath the single currency. The project forced a one-size-fits-all monetary regime onto vastly different national realities. North and South, creditors and debtors, exporters and importers bound by a single interest rate and currency. This was meant to bind Europe together, but in practice it often pried it apart. Boom and bust cycles hit unevenly, cheap credit flooded southern countries while northern banks profited, until the imbalance exploded in crisis. Lacking the flexibility of separate currencies or the cushion of a fiscal union, countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy faced economic collapse when the global financial storm hit. Europe's response, rather than reimagining the flawed structure, was to tighten the belts. Austerity was prescribed as the cure for all, ignoring how differently it affected each member. The lofty promise of ever closer union gave way to recrimination, stronger economies blaming weaker ones for profligacy, weaker ones accusing stronger of strangling their growth. In truth, no one had truly integrated these diverse economic systems. They were merely yoked together, pre-managed by rules that demanded convergence without providing the means for it. Broken dreams followed. An entire generation saw the European dream of prosperity falter, growth stalled, and job prospects withered. By the mid-2010s, some countries had sunk into depression-like conditions. When nearly 1 out of 2 young people in the hardest-hit nations could not find work, the statistics became personal. Each percentage point a story of a career that might never begin, a family member leaving home in search of opportunity abroad. Such outcomes revealed a compromised union, a tower built high but hollowed from within by the failure to accommodate the very diversity it claimed to celebrate. The European project, rather than uniting in strength, often unified in stagnation, locking disparate economies into a rigid framework that few leaders seemed to fully understand or were willing to fundamentally reform. Distrust from youth and mismanaged care. The human cost of these economic failures has etched itself most bitterly on Europe's youth. A continent that once promised opportunity without borders, instead delivered a decade of lost prospects and painful uncertainty for the young. Youth unemployment soared into the double digits across the Eurozone, spiking above 40% in countries like Spain and Greece at the height of the crisis. These dry numbers hid real despair. Millions of educated young Europeans found themselves stranded in idleness, their aspirations dashed just as they reached adulthood. Many became involuntary exiles, emigrating en masse from southern and eastern Europe in search of work, fracturing families and communities. Those who stayed often had to accept precarious gigs or lengthy internships with little pay, indefinitely deferring the stability their parents took for granted. In this climate, a profound distrust has taken root among the youth, distrust in institutions that promise to care for them. Europe's vaunted welfare states, once a safety net, now often feel like a web of holes through which the young routinely fall. Social protections frequently exclude young people by design or by bureaucracy, unemployment benefits tied to long work histories that youths haven't had a chance to build, housing assistance denied to those under a certain age, or education budgets slashed under fiscal austerity. The mismanagement of societal care is glaring. During the crisis years, austerity measures targeted public services and education, the very investments that shape future generations, as easy cuts. Policymakers justified it as necessary discipline, but to the young it felt like betrayal, a sacrifice of their future to pay for the older generation's mistakes. In Southern Europe, they speak of a lost generation. Across the EU, surveys have recorded plummeting levels of youth trust in national governments and EU leadership alike. It is as if an implicit generational contract was broken. The youth look at a union that proclaimed unity and solidarity, and see instead indifference and self-preservation. In response, many young Europeans have withdrawn from conventional politics, or turned to street protests, grassroots movements, even bursts of nihilistic humor on social media, dark jokes about eating the rich or guillotines in the square betraying a mix of anger and cynicism. If European integration was meant to safeguard the next generation's peace and prosperity, its faltering reality has left them cynical, wounded, and painfully aware of the hypocrisy in the sermons of their elders. Cynicism toward elites and ideologies. As the promises of integration soured, a corrosive cynicism spread throughout society, aimed both at the ruling elite and at the grand ideologies that once inspired hope. In the aftermath of the crisis, Europeans witnessed scenes that seemed scripted in irony: millionaire ministers preaching austerity to ordinary families, unelected technocrats from Brussels and Frankfurt overruling the policies of elected national leaders. The EU's top officials insisted their hands were tied by rules and markets, even as they rewrote rules on the fly to rescue banks and protect the common currency. Such episodes have convinced many that Europe's elite serve an abstract system, not the people. Even democracy felt like a managed performance. When Greek citizens voted in a referendum to reject austerity terms in 2015, the decision was swiftly swept aside. Under external pressure, reinforcing the public's belief that popular will meant little when it clashed with the imperatives of financial powers and bureaucrats. In Eastern member states, young people who grew up after communism have learned to mistrust authority by default, first taught that free markets and EU membership would bring paradise, now seeing instead corruption, unemployment, and leaders trading national dignity for EU funds. They harbor a deep skepticism of any grand narratives. Indeed, across the Union a paradoxical trend emerged. Socialism, or at least the idea of socialism, regained popularity among disaffected youth, not out of naive idealism but almost out of spite towards the status quo. Polls began to show a surprising number of millennials favoring socialist economic systems or heavy redistribution. Yet this coexists with a cynical recognition that those in power, whether they claim to be capitalist or socialist, rarely deliver on their lofty rhetoric. Many remember that several austerity programs were implemented by parties calling themselves social democratic. They have seen erstwhile socialist leaders quietly reassure global financiers that nothing fundamental would change. As a result, belief in traditional left-right politics has eroded. What remains is often a performative cynicism. Slogans like "Eat the Rich" go viral more as cathartic jokes than serious policy demands, while far-right demagogues and self-styled revolutionaries both try to harness the public's anger. Trust in the European project and its leadership has been badly shaken, arguably in a more dangerous way than mere apathy, for cynicism is a brittle glue holding society together. It breeds an atmosphere where everyone expects betrayal as the norm. Solidarity becomes suspect, cynicism becomes common sense. In such an environment, even genuine calls for unity or reform are met with rolling eyes and knowing smirks, as if Europe has heard it all before and no longer believes salvation is on the way. Symbolic structures devoid of essence. Underpinning this disillusionment is a feeling that modern European society is living in the shadow of symbols with little substance behind them. The EU's institutional architecture, its commissions, councils, parliaments, and pacts, often seems to citizens like a grand facade, impressive in appearance, baffling in its complexity, and distant from everyday life. Treaties speak of values and union, directives invoke rights and responsibilities, leaders make pronouncements dripping with historical destiny, yet these words increasingly feel like scriptures recited without spirit, revered texts whose true meaning was lost or hollowed out by rote interpretation. European integration, in this view, became a secular religion of sorts. It has its temples in Brussels and Strasbourg, its high priests in suits, its congregation of member states. It preaches ever closer union, but when asked union for whom, or union for what purpose, it offers only ceremonial answers. Citizens sense this emptiness. They see national governments performing loyalty to European unity at summits, only to defend narrow interests behind closed doors. They see EU institutions champion human rights and dignity, yet enforcing policies that left many in indignity. Whether it was the pensioner sleeping rough in Athens after cuts, or the refugee kept outside Fortress Europe. This gap between symbol and reality has fostered a kind of edge-like social consciousness, a lingering, pervasive feeling that society stands at the threshold of something profound but cannot quite step forward. It is edge-like in that people hover between belief and disbelief, between yearning for a greater meaning and resignation to meaninglessness. Europe's streets are calm on the surface, but there is a psychic restlessness, an acute awareness of being on an unstable ledge of history. Social trust frays, and in its place creeps a nebulous anxiety, the sense that the system is running on inertia, with elaborate structures that command respect but no longer inspire genuine allegiance. This is a fundamentally metaphysical crisis, a union lacking telos, a deeper purpose or soul. Just as a beautifully written scripture becomes a dead letter if read without understanding, a transnational society loses its legitimacy if its organizing principles become mere rituals. Europe's common currency, common laws, common market. These are the letters of integration. But without a common spirit of community that people can feel in their bones, these letters can do little more than constrain. In the end, they sit atop society like an austere framework, observed and followed perhaps, but not loved. Order imposed without essence leaves people psychologically in limbo, present yet not truly invested. The result is a Europe that is nominally whole but existentially adrift, a grand experiment now searching for the living core of meaning it forgot to cultivate, a cycle of control and the Kardashev constraint. Stepping back, one can see European integration as part of a larger cycle of control that has characterized human social organization for millennia. Empires, unions, leagues. Time and again, we construct mighty frameworks to bring order and progress, only to find ourselves constrained by our own creation. The European Union, with its intricate governance and diplomatic loops, is a contemporary echo of this ancient pattern. Its crises and oscillations, debt debacles, endless summits, reform plans perpetually watered down, reflect humanity's broader tendency to become entangled in the very structures that were meant to liberate us. Instead of boldly leaping toward a new paradigm, we default to familiar patterns, tightening control when faced with uncertainty. This has profound implications when viewed against the scale of civilization's potential. Futurists speak of the Kardashev scale, which imagines human civilization's growth through harnessing greater energy and expanding beyond its planet. By such measures, our society today is still very much Type 0, not even a planetary civilization, and one wonders if our preoccupation with maintaining control has kept us so. The mental energy of our brightest leaders is spent on managing agreements, crises, and bureaucratic rituals, rather than transcending our paradigms. We have, in effect, locked our collective consciousness into diplomatic circuits and default ideologies, endlessly recycling the known instead of embracing the unknown. The European project, far from being a springboard to higher human collaboration, sometimes appears as another closed loop. Nations and officials negotiating ceaselessly over rules and budgets, revising treaties that always stop short of fundamental change. It is as if humanity stands before an open door to the stars, but cannot step through because it's still arguing over the house rules. The cycle goes on, control breeds stagnation, which breeds fear, to which the response is more control. And so, our civilization remains technologically advanced in pockets yet spiritually and societally earthbound. Conclusion. From Babylon to Egypt, in this reflective critique, Europe emerges as Babylonian in its illusions of order and Egyptian in its bondage of the spirit. Like Babylon, it has built imposing towers, financial systems, regulatory regimes, grand halls of power, projecting an image of unity reaching toward heaven. But these towers rest on uncertain ground, and their order is illusory so long as they lack the human understanding and empathy that give order life. And like the biblical Egypt, today's civilization, embodied by Europe but not limited to it, keeps its people in a kind of metaphysical bondage, confined within structures that dictate the scope of the possible, trapped in the paradigms of yesterday. We remain collectively in exile from our potential, hesitant to leave the familiar land of control even as its constraints grow tighter. The European Union, for all its laudable aims of peace and cooperation, exemplifies this paradox. It is a union achieved without transcendence, progress built without profundity. It shows us that grand projects can indeed reimagine society, but without a living spirit at their core, They risk becoming yet another unfulfilled structure added to history's cycle. Ultimately, the challenge extends beyond Europe. It asks whether humanity can break out of this cycle of Babel, to finally wed our knowledge with wisdom, our structures with soul. Until we do, we may remain in the long shadow of our self-made pyramids, gazing at the promised land of a higher civilization, but never quite stepping into the reality we were meant to become. References: Generation Austerity marked by poverty, 1 in 5 young people in OECD nations, and marginalization. 3. Elliot, Larry, and Helena Smith. IMF to admit mistakes in handling Greek debt crisis and bailout. The Guardian, June 5, 2013. Reports on internal IMF documents acknowledging serious errors in the Greek bailout. The IMF admitted it underestimated the damage that harsh austerity would inflict on Greece, which underwent a depression-like contraction. The fund had to bend its own rules to approve rescues, illustrating how technocratic fixes prioritized saving the euro's framework even as Greek unemployment and poverty surged, a key economic policy failure of the EU crisis response. 4. Transnational Institute. Disrupting European authoritarianism, grassroots organizing. During the Eurozone crisis. May 2018. This analysis describes how EU institutions responded to the debt crisis with a combination of austerity and authoritarianism, using technocratic, depoliticized governance that eroded democratic participation. It notes that enforcing bailout conditions and fiscal rules often meant sidelining popular will, contributing to a loss of trust in elites. Nevertheless, it also records how social movements arose in reaction, reflecting public discontent with both the economic pain and the democratic deficit in the EU's crisis management. 5. Youth Perspectives on Europe. Hertie School 2017. Regional Youth Studies in Southeast Europe found that while support for joining the EU was high before accession, it dropped by almost 50% in countries after they entered the Union, evidence of unmet expectations leading to disillusionment. The research highlights pervasive low trust in political institutions among youth across Europe, and a sense that the European integration process has not delivered on promises of opportunity and good governance, fueling apathy and cynicism among young citizens. Philosophical and metaphysical reflections. The human psyche is driven by a primordial hunger for knowledge, for meaning, as if survival itself depended on understanding. This hunger for wisdom becomes a survival mechanism of mind, a desperate will to meaning that drives us to construct reality when reality falls apart. In the void of uncertainty, the psyche conjures something rather than nothing. Beliefs, schemas, even illusions. These constructs act as cognitive scaffolding that holds our existence together. Even a corrupted truth or inverted dogma can seem better than chaos. Even a beautiful lie can function as a life raft. Like prisoners in Plato's cave clinging to shadows, we depend on our self-made images of the world to feel secure. We build intricate inner architectures of knowledge to make sense of the senseless, to impose order on disorder. Wisdom, even when warped into fanaticism or fantasy, still provides a framework to live. The mind, in its hunger, will feed on fictions if it must, because the alternative is to starve in meaninglessness. Yet the reality we construct is not a single linear story. It is a paradox, a tapestry woven of overlapping narratives, past and future, real and imagined. We often speak of the timeline as if life were a straight arrow, but lived reality resembles a web of branching paths and folded dimensions. Time itself is not the constant we assume. It is a symbolic lattice woven through consciousness. In moments of crisis or revelation, our ordinary sense of time can fracture, past, present, and future spill into each other in a four-dimensional flux. A mind under great stress or great insight may experience time non-linearly, a phenomenon described almost literally in Psychosis, where the chronological order of events gives way to a butterfly effect across time. What was, what is, and what could be coexist and influence one another. Modern physics lends credence to this intuition. Relativity tells us there is no single universal now, and some physicists even argue that time's flow is an illusion. The distinction between past and future might be nothing more than a persistently convincing mirage. In other words, reality is not a simple sequence, but a superposition. This is where metaphysics and myth enter the frame. If time is a construct of consciousness, we find ourselves echoing ancient insights. The Hermetic sages claimed all is mind, that the material world is a kind of mental projection, not fixed reality. In Eastern wisdom, the world is Maya, an illusion or dream from which we must awaken. Reality has always been portrayed as paradoxical in esoteric teachings, at once real and unreal, a play of forms concealing an underlying formlessness. Our scientific narratives now mirror the mythic ones. Cosmology speaks of time warping in gravity's grip, of particles popping in and out of quantum superposition, of parallel universes branching with every decision. Likewise, Hermetic and mystical traditions speak of cosmic cycles, of the eternal return, of higher planes of existence where our linear logic breaks down. The language differs, one speaks in equations, the other in symbols, but both grapple with a truth beyond straightforward comprehension, that our common-sense reality is a narrowed slice of a much stranger cosmos. In this strange cosmos, disconnection can be something more than mere psychological fracture. It becomes an ontological dispersion. When a mind dissociates or breaks from consensual reality, it may be experiencing a spillover of those multiple overlapping realities. Consider the experience of a psychotic or dissociated mind. It does not simply lose touch with reality, it often creates its own. This creation is not random madness. It is the psyche's attempt to survive by seeking coherence in a state of fragmentation. If the official reality is unbearable or incoherent, the mind will populate the void with a new narrative, a private cosmos where things make sense again. We might say the soul spreads itself across many possible timelines like a deck of scattered cards, searching each fragment for a livable story. It is an act of profound creativity and desperation, dissociation as a survival strategy on a metaphysical level. One finds meaning elsewhere, in some other moment, some other imagined life, when the here and now offers none. This dispersion across what could be is the mind's way of keeping life going, a cognitive multiverse generated to escape the singularity of pain. Crucially, there remains a drive toward coherence, an alchemical drive to reorganize these disparate pieces back into a continuity that can sustain a self. The scattered psyche seeks to remember itself, gathering the shards of past and future into a present it can survive. This is no trivial task. It is a metaphysical act, akin to a god recombining the fragments of a shattered world. In mythological terms, one might recall the story of the god Osiris, cut into pieces and dispersed, whose parts were gathered and reassembled by love and wisdom. So too, the disintegrated consciousness tries to retrieve its lost pieces across time, to heal the rift. Each shard of self or experience carries a piece of the overall puzzle, and the soul laboriously works to synchronize them, to weave them into a narrative that feels whole. The search for coherence is, in essence, the soul's quest for salvation. Not in a religious sense, but in the sense of wholeness. It is the instinct to restore order from chaos, to find meaningful patterns in what was seemingly random trauma. This process may appear as delusion or regression to outsiders, but seen from within it is deeply purposeful. It is the psyche performing triage, stitching a torn fabric of reality back together with threads of imagination and memory. From this perspective, even death itself becomes not an end but a transformation of pattern and information. If life is a story woven by mind, death is simply a point where the weave is undone and begun anew in a different form. We can refract this through both spiritual and scientific prisms. Mystical traditions have long viewed death as a threshold, a crossing into another realm or mode of being, not the annihilation of the soul. And intriguingly, some interpretations of modern physics suggest that information, the fundamental fabric of reality, can never be truly destroyed, only changed in form. The energy and information that constituted a living consciousness might disperse at death, but they are reconfigured rather than erased. One narrative ends, but its elements are recycled into the grand narrative of the cosmos. In this way, death is a threshold of continuity, a dissolution of one coherence to allow a larger coherence to emerge. For the individual soul, it may be experienced as liberation or as passage. Think of the caterpillar entering the chrysalis. From the caterpillar's point of view, the world is ending. From the butterflies, a world is being born. The informational structure that was self is not lost. It is transmuted, integrated into new patterns, whether in memory, in influence, or in metaphysical forms beyond our understanding. Stepping back, we see that these themes, hunger for knowledge, reality's paradoxes, fragmentation, and coherence, spiral around a common center. Throughout this work, we address the entropy and control in society, the rise of AI, the decay of economies, the crisis of psyche. Now we ascend that spiral, observing how each is a manifestation of deeper archetypes. The struggle for societal order mirrors the mind's struggle for coherence. Governments and systems impose narratives, laws, ideologies to hold chaos at bay, much as an individual psyche clings to beliefs to survive uncertainty. Economic entropy, the tendency of human structures to fall apart or consume themselves, echoes the universal law of entropy in physics, and also the breakdown of meaning that can occur in a life or a culture. We see our world spinning toward disorder, yet within that chaos, new orders can emerge just as a broken mind can rearrange into an unexpected new understanding. Artificial intelligence, our modern golem, embodies the same hunger for knowledge, trained on data, seeking patterns. It is an externalized cognitive scaffolding. We built AI hoping it would bring hyper-rational order, but we find it inherits our biases and paradoxes. It creates new realities, simulations, predictions that can clash with the human narrative. And psychosis, far from being a trivial aberration, appears here as a poignant microcosm of all these tensions, the individual's internal rebellion against an unbearable reality, producing a private world that both saves and isolates them. It is no coincidence that the word apocalypse in Greek means revelation. In the breakdown of consensus reality, something new and previously hidden may be revealed. The psychotic mind may unwittingly tap into truths, or at least offer novel perspectives, though at great personal cost, much as society's upheavals can yield new paradigms. In the end, all these threads converge on a simple but profound realization. Reality is not a fixed given. It is actively woven by hungry, meaning-seeking agents, be they human souls or whole societies or even machineries of our invention. We are weavers of reality, and also the pattern being woven. Life is a paradoxical loom where order and chaos, fact and fiction, self and cosmos all intermingle. We return then to our starting motifs, but at a higher turn of the spiral. What began as personal or societal crisis is now seen as part of a cosmic creative process. Our darkest psychoses and grandest technologies, our myths and our sciences, are all attempts at navigation, feeling our way through a reality too vast and layered to ever fully comprehend. We hunger, we reach, we err, we learn, and we transform. The very structures that enslave our minds can also free them when viewed from a new angle. The very knowledge that corrupted can, in inverted form, become wisdom. Every end heralds a new beginning in the endless spiral of existence. In this heightened vision, wisdom is not a static truth, but a living, dynamic scaffold, one that must sometimes be broken and remade. Reality is not one story but many, a chorus of timelines where even time's flow is a chorus of rhythms rather than a single beat. And coherence is not given, it is achieved, through struggle, insight, and the irrepressible will of life, to keep knitting itself together from the frayed threads. Standing at this reflective culmination, we understand that we have been participants in a grand myth all along, the myth of a self and a society striving to know themselves. That striving, that hunger, is both our curse and our glory. It drives us mad and drives us forward. It leads us to build prisons of thought and also to break free of them. It is the engine of evolution, mental, spiritual, and cosmic. Thus, as we conclude these metaphysical reflections, we spiral back to where we started, but nothing is quite the same. We have shed skins of understanding and grown new ones. The society, the AI, the economy, the psyche, each has been a mirror and a metaphor for the others. And beyond them all, the spiral continues upward and outward into the uncharted realms of possibility. We leave with more questions perhaps than answers, but also with a reverence for the mystery, the realization that the fragmented pieces of our experience were always part of a greater whole. In that truth lies a kind of solace, even a liberation. The mind's hunger may never be satisfied, but in chasing knowledge it continually reconstructs the world, and occasionally transcends it. Conclusion. Through labyrinths of madness and the cold machinery of modern life, we have wandered and wondered. We confronted illusions that held us captive, faced systems that failed us with their empty promises, and tended to the silent hunger that drove us beyond the edge of reason. In the wake of these trials, time itself lost its straight arrow. Past and future bled into one another, and reality often felt like a paradox beyond comprehension. Yet, after all the outward and inward journeys, every thread of meaning converges here, at the center of the self. It is here, in this quiet and unassuming core, that the final work begins, the work of becoming whole again, reconnecting with self, body, mind, and soul. Fragmented by trauma, time, and the cacophony of society, I found my very being shattered into pieces. At times, it seemed as if my mind had splintered across different moments in time, each shard living in a yesterday or a tomorrow, just to escape the emptiness of now. I once made my body into a solitary church, when all other faiths failed me, seeking refuge in the only sanctuary I felt I had left. Even then, I discovered how estranged I had become from myself. Even in that private temple of body and mind, my soul felt absent, my nature stripped away. Reconnecting with the self after such dissociation becomes a sacred task, both healing and reassembly. It is the slow, careful gathering of scattered fragments, the fitting together of pieces that no longer align perfectly, as if reassembling a broken mirror whose cracks will always remain visible. This is not a mere return to a former wholeness, for we can never be exactly who we were before the break. Instead, it is a metaphysical remembering, a putting together of what was dismembered. The fragments of body, mind, and soul must learn to recognize each other again. It means teaching the body that it is safe to feel, teaching the mind that it can trust its own quiet truths over the blaring falsehoods outside, and nourishing the soul with meaning where before there was a void. In this process of reassembly, coherence is slowly distilled from chaos. We create a new form of wholeness, one that carries the hairline fractures of past shatterings but is stronger for them. This hard-won wholeness is a lived answer to the psychic survival that once kept us alive in pieces. It is the mind healing from an Alzheimer's of consciousness, relearning the contours of its own being. It is the soul emerging from hiding, reaching out to the mind and body like a patient lover returning home at last. In reclaiming this unity, we begin to survive not as scattered sparks, but as an integrated flame once more. Surviving 1, 0, and multidimensionally. Survival unfolds on many levels at once. There is the linear survival, life lived one day and then the next, footsteps following the narrow path of time. To survive one-dimensionally is to endure within the story that society recognizes, moving along a line of past, present, future. I have learned to walk that line, however unsteadily, chaining one thought to the next, finding sanity in the simple sequence of sunrise and sunset. This one-dimensional existence is the world of clocks and calendars, of cause and effect, a world that often demands we ignore the hollows and branching paths just to carry on. But survival is also needed in the null spaces, the zero-dimensional pits where time and meaning collapse. These are the moments when existence shrinks to a single point, a zero, when you feel disconnected from the narrative of your life, severed from any timeline or purpose. In that void, surviving means holding on to the faint spark of I am without any plot to carry it. It is the effort of enduring emptiness, outlasting the nights when your soul feels like a ghost in a world that can't hear you. Zero-dimensional survival is the quietest fight, the invisible breath that continues even when your world has gone dark and still. It is profoundly difficult, a test of whether being itself, in its most raw and featureless form, is enough. Yet from the stillness of that null space, you learn to find a ground zero of self, a place from which to rebuild. Then there is survival across many realities. The multidimensional survival of a mind that has lived 1,000 lives in fevered thought and dream. In the midst of psychosis, or even in the play of imagination and memory, I have inhabited plural timelines. My mind spread itself out like constellations across the night sky of possibility, each star a self that might have been, each flicker a story or a trauma from another time. To survive multidimensionally is to avoid being torn apart by these parallel threads of existence. It is to navigate the labyrinth of overlapping experiences, the echo of many pasts and the pull of many futures, without losing the central thread of who I am. This kind of survival requires a supple soul, a resilience that can hold contradictions and paradoxes without shattering. It is the art of being many and one at once, to carry the innumerable facets of a life and of life itself, and still emerge as a coherent presence. We survive one-dimensionally by clinging to the simple hope of tomorrow, zero-dimensionally by enduring the silent emptiness, and multidimensionally by making peace with complexity and paradox. In truth, these layers of survival are always intertwined. A single day's linear march can suddenly plunge into the zero of despair, or explode into the kaleidoscope of flashbacks and fantasies. And so survival becomes a braided cord, one strand keeping time, one holding space, one weaving all the divergent threads together. The human spirit is tasked with learning to live in all these modes, often at once. By recognizing this layered existence, I finally begin to understand what resilience truly means. It is the ability to be present on that narrow, one-dimensional path, while also allowing the soul to roam deserts and galaxies, to keep breathing in the void, and to keep believing in the unimaginable. It is an act of balance and faith, a promise to keep going, no matter what dimension of being we find ourselves in. The next chapter. Now, at the end of this written journey, a new unwritten chapter opens before us, one that exists beyond any page. Life itself is the next chapter, an open horizon where each moment asks us to awaken anew. If these words have been a mirror, then the next step is for each reader to face their own reflection in the world and write their own story of becoming. Beyond the confines of this text, reality stretches out around us like a vast desert of choices. Each choice is a grain of sand slipping through our fingers, each grain carrying echoes of memory, trauma, and hope. We stand in this desert at twilight, feeling the day's heat give way to a cool hush. In the distance, past and future meld in a dimming golden light. This is the hour when our shadows grow long and the choices we left unmade linger like ghosts on the dunes. Yet as night falls, stars emerge, each a tiny promise that even in darkness, new possibilities glitter overhead. The season turning around us is autumnal. The air itself smells of endings and ripe beginnings. Leaves drift down from ancient trees, each leaf a story letting go, each bare branch a quiet promise of new growth after the coming winter. We find ourselves in the autumn of this journey, a time of harvest and release, of wisdom gathered and illusions shed like dry leaves underfoot. There is sorrow in it, a mourning for what must fall away. And yet there is gentle hope as well, for those fallen leaves nourish the soil, and the cycle will return green to the branches in time. In this way, every ending becomes a seed for rebirth. The light is fading now, a final flare of orange on the horizon, and the circle is closing. All that has happened, all the madness and insight, the despair and beauty, is folding into the earth of memory. It will lie there through the winter of forgetting and remembrance, waiting for some new spring of understanding to draw it forth again. Thus, this conclusion is not an end at all, but a pause, a twilight between day and night, between chapters written and chapters yet to come. The loop of our story closes, only to spiral out into the next unknown. We carry forward a haunting continuity, the voices of our past selves, the lessons and paradoxes, still whisper in the wind around us. But we also carry an open possibility, the freedom to step beyond all that we have been into all that we could be. In the desert of reality, under the autumn sky, we stand with pen in hand, ready to write on the blank page of tomorrow. The journey of awakening continues, an endless story coiled within each of us, waiting for the living author of life to begin the next chapter.